player expression. It's a talking point as old as the modern FGC itself at this point, and I'm not here to try to explain it away or define it or anything like that. I want to talk about where the problems lay with this talking point, the same way problems do with most of these Twitter prompts that show up every few months. I just want to say, you don't actually care about player expression in fighting games. There's no problem with player expression, there's no actual outrage over player choice in fighting games,
and there is no Queen of England.
It's really that simple, and realistically, that's fine. Here's what I mean. The definition most people have agreed on over the last few years is this. If I can recognize who's playing and there's no tag, the game has great player expression. And to an extent, this is actually correct, but it's also not the full encompassing statement people think that it is. If this was all that it was, then a player's costume choice would play into this, wouldn't it? I know that Mena RD is the only person on the planet with this specifically designed costume in Street Fighter V, so if I remove his tag, there's literally no doubt in my mind that I'm watching him play on stage. By the definition I listed, Street Fighter V must have fantastic player expression, as it's the only fighting game I know to have something like that. But no, obviously that's not what people mean, is it? What we're actually looking for is a definition that's a bit more concise and definitely focused on the gameplay. So for this one, we're gonna have to dig just a little bit deeper.
What are you doing? Digging. Why? Make a hole. A hole for what? More digging. Okay then.
In a paper about creating games to bolster learning written by Kurt Squire, a difficult question arose. How do you create spaces that ultimately exist for people to do interesting things? He mentions the difficulties of choreographing the rules, representations, and roles for players. In other words, the contexts in which players can generate meaning. There's more to this that I'll get into later in the video, but I want to break down this part first.
Oh my God, no. I can't believe he did it again. I can't believe he did it again. He did it again. Oh my God.
Squire mentions that good games are vehicles for player expression, and in my opinion, fighting games mostly tackle or try to tackle this overarching question of allowing players to generate meaning more than most other genres. Meaning in situations is how we get our Evo Moment 37s. It's why Rangchu becoming a world champion inspired thousands to try and do the same, and it's what gives us these kinds of callouts.
Everyone's yelling. It's so hype. Come on, man. Go, man, go.
We know these players aren't just mashing, we know that they know what they're doing, and sometimes we can't believe the answers they come to. But what I think is happening is that we're conflating player expression simply with the number of options we have to interact with. Modern fighting games have taken tons of criticism for this mix-up between the number of options and the meaning of said options.
It seems to make sense at a glance, where it's like, if a character has a ton of tools, then players have more options to use, which means it will be easier to tell the difference between players. But that's not always necessarily true.
The reason some decisions or options may seem non-consequential or stale is likely because of loss aversion. Loss aversion is the idea that when people are met with an opportunity to make as much as they could lose, the fear of loss outweighs the potential gains by twice as much.
I want you to consider this bet. Here's $10. This could be yours. If I flip this coin in the air, you guys call it in the air. If you're right, I give you the $10. If you're wrong, you give me $10.
I saw that coming.
That's not a good bet for me.
People have complained about the way Street Fighter 6 feels compared to Street Fighter 5, or how Guilty Gear Strive compares to the games that came before, but what's really happening is mostly that some of the options we were used to just get switched for others. It's easy to dogpile on modern fighting games for removing options from players, but realistically, I think I see the opposite happening. A great example is the execution of Street Fighter 4. It was revered, and people hold that game to an incredibly high standard since it had tight links, precise special inputs, and as long as you practice, you could be really good once you got the hit. And that's awesome, Being able to put tons of time into your execution is certainly one form of player expression, and some players choose to express themselves that way in games that don't even have high execution barriers. But the thing about Street Fighter IV was that it was very easy to loop offense into what was called vortexes. Essentially, once you got knocked down, it was time to guess, and if you got hit again, you'd be forced to guess once more until you maybe get it right. These offensive feedback loops would remove certain options from you as well, like the ability to reversal or change the timing of your wake-ups to at least keep your attacker on their toes. So in this case, on one hand, there's tons of player expression, but on the other, that second player literally doesn't get to play. No matter who Tokido was vortexing, you'd never be able to guess who it was because they didn't get to do anything.
Oh, drops it.
Wow, he landed on top, and Chris is not looking great.
Now, if I'm arguing that vortexes were bad for player expression, then what would be an example of something that's good for players on defense to express themselves? What I've noticed is that active defense is a fantastic way for players to express themselves even when they're not on the offensive. But sometimes these decisions of active defense are made to seem scrubby, or they can be used to call the other player random.
I'm not though.
Who does that?
Street Fighter 6 actually has an incredible amount of player expression on both defense and offense that really doesn't get talked about enough. At Gamers 8, we got to watch Kakeru demolish Angry Bird, who had just won the most stacked fighting game tournament of possibly all time, using almost nothing but defensive mechanics. Sure, low forward drive rush can dominate the game, but that's just scratching the surface of what this game has to offer if we can just look past the idea of scrubby active defense. Even in Street Fighter V, I was forced to get creative and weigh my options against what they meant to me, and use all of that information to formulate my own playstyle that nobody could replicate even if they wanted to. Overall, we're not losing our ability to express ourselves, but we are being forced to adapt to an entirely different medium as fighting games progress. It's easy to focus on the options that we lose, but try and see the options that you gained as well. Actually, funnily enough, there's one thing we've gained that laughably helps illustrate this point. Operation Phalanx, or Fast Assault Lashing at Neutral Exchanges, is a small conspiracy that I've come up with perpetrated by pretty much every modern fighting game on the market. A big reason I wanted to make this video was because at first I did think we were losing ways to express ourselves. If I wanted to play good and honest footsies, I was supposed to go to Street Fighter. If I wanted crisp movement and matchups to study for years, I'm supposed to go to Tekken. And if I want cursed mix-ups with inconceivably unfair characters, I'd go to Guilty Gear. But as of recording, this time in 2023, all three of those games have forward-advancing, armored or invincible guard-breaking techniques as universal game mechanics. Street Fighter 6 has Drive Impact, Guilty Gear has Wild Assault, and Tekken 8 has Heat, which enhances certain moves. And the crazy part is, it's not even just these games. The latest King of Fighters has them in Shatter Strikes, and even Grand Blue Fantasy got them in Rising. So if every major fighting game release has this happening, we have to ask ourselves, why? When I started researching for this video, I thought genuinely that this was it for the idea of pure and honest footsies. As seen in Street Fighter 6, Drive Impact has without a doubt changed the value of pokes in a neutral setting. But what if I told you that I think that's what Capcom wants?
Just fireball and drive rush, fireball, drive rush, fireball, drive rush, fireball, drive rush. Sweep, 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 sweep. With every regular button they press. But it doesn't really matter because they could just do fireball and then drive rush, sway.
If you want to play honest footsies, or you want to get into a good fireball war, by all means you can. Games that boast that type of gameplay are easier to play now than ever, and new ones are still being made. But to say that Street Fighter has always been one thing is a weird thing to say, as it truly hasn't. Each one is more different from its previous iteration than the last, and we have every reason to believe that trend is going to continue. Fighting games of modern times want us to be able to express ourselves even when we're pressed on the back foot.
Dash forward! Oh!
Watch it.
Oh, the
got the block. Just stop completely. Another round of
The way we express ourselves is changing in this new era of fighting games, and I for one think that's a good thing. No need to stick with traditional acrylic paints when we have flashy watercolors right here. It's okay to express ourselves through different mediums and on different canvases. We're here to enjoy fighting games and process all the information and situations put forth by them. That's what developers hope for us to experience.
Fighting game is something so great.
A fantastic example of how ridiculous this argument is if I were to compare fighting games to another pastime like surfing. Surfing is a sport with origins that date way back, like at least 700 years or so. And yet, in the 1950s in the United States, some surfer bros decided that surfing in the water wasn't enough, and they became the first asphalt surfers. Eventually, this new mode of transportation gained traction, and people started calling it skateboarding while they're doing all sorts of new tricks that nobody had seen before since they wouldn't work on surfboards. But if this was the FGC, the response would be to say that skateboarding is cool and all, but it's just you pumping on the board and there's no interactions with the ocean waves, which means there's no actual skater expression.
I don't think that counts as footsies, and I would know. I've been playing Luke since Third Strike.
And such a statement really doesn't need much explanation to realize how crazy it is. Skateboarding would go on to become one of the most free-form manners of physical expression there is, and it continues to evolve to this day despite being a separate and new experience from surfing, which is where it came from in the beginning. All of this is to say, as our games evolve, so too do our means of expression, and that's important to remember when we get a new game that feels completely different than the one that came before. As games evolve, we also see changes in the way people learn them. In the same quote from Squire, he begins to outline an issue that comes from how players interpret the information presented in front of them. Games are no longer just played between you and your friends. Fighting games specifically can consist of couch versus games with a sibling, followed by dozens of games in ranked, topped off with a Twitter nightcap of digesting opinions from random players and professionals alike. How are game developers supposed to manage that stream of information for you? Well, realistically in our case, they're not. But let's try to pretend that they are.
Throw the controller 2 times? What the fuck does that mean?
Squire goes on to say that when we have this many sources of information in-game and out-of-game, a potential paradox arises. There's no way for the developers to be in tune with why everybody wants to play the game and how they're playing it. A casual player in Gold is going to have a very different experience than someone in Legend rank. And because of that, they're going to process the information extremely differently.
Yeah, I like that! Flip that controller, huh?
So, as an example, a player in Iron rank of Street Fighter 6 might look at Drive Impact and see it as a combo breaker, and while that might sound extreme, it actually has happened to players and it is still happening every day. This isn't to say that Capcom didn't tell them what DI was, they certainly did, but what the player learned in playing the game was entirely different, because in ranks where people are more likely to drop their combos and continue to press buttons, a DI is effectively a combo breaker. So by teaching the players what the move really did, they welcomed a totally new problem for these players when they start to learn in later ranks that there aren't combo breakers in Street Fighter 6. Now take that and add the aspect of the community, and suddenly things get even more confusing. But at the end of the day, depending on how seriously they're taking the game, the odds of learning the truth before dropping the game are probably about 50-50. And you might be asking yourself, why would I bring this up when we're talking about player expression? And I'll tell you why. It's because this paradox pretty much only appears in the most open-ended games with the most room for player expression. This idea of Street Fighter 6 being scrubby is because in reality, we're kind of against player expression existing in a way that's not just on offense.
I'm being expressive. My gameplay is expressing. I missed the tag, whoops.
And I know people will get upset at me for saying that, but I mostly mean it in the Street Fighter sense. Although people have a lot to say about the defensive mechanics in Dragon Ball FighterZ too, but that's another topic for another day. In Street Fighter 6, the attacker has a similar amount on their mind when compared to the player on defense. There's always the threat of a perfect parry when your offense is too predictable, even if it is theoretically airtight. And while many say this is busted and needs to go, I think that response misses the point of what Street Fighter 6 is trying to be.
You're missing the point.
In the same way that Street Fighter 3 tried to break away from being Street Fighter and failed, I think 6 is actually nailing it. The game barely looks like a Street Fighter and definitely doesn't feel like any of its past iterations, because why would the developers want to just make another version of a game that they've already made? The issue with comparing these newer games to those of the past is that obviously the developers didn't want it to be like those past games. The games aren't bad, but if they were going to try to recreate that, why not just make Super Ultra Omega Hyper Street Fighter 4 and continue that till the end of time? The answer to that question is really simple. They just don't want to, and neither do you. In a study performed at F.A.L.A.N.X University, students were encouraged to play the simulation game Civilization and become familiar with it. As they got better at the game, communities formed that experimented with it, not only for understanding its rules, but also its mechanics. Players optimized solutions for hundreds of situations, and even began to find exploits to beat the AI at any difficulty. Eventually, however, certain players started to become so familiar with the mechanics that they would remove rules and change the way the game worked entirely. These players essentially created their own game within a game and started creating their own simulations with different rules for other people to try. This cycle is what happens in our beloved fighting game franchises as well. Street Fighter 6 is a perfect example of such an evolution. We've got new faces at the helm of the game, and the mechanics are all nods to different things we've seen in Street Fighter from the past. We have parry from Street Fighter 3, DI kinda works like focus attack from Street Fighter 4, and supers are a nod to the V-triggers and supers from 4 as well. Our fighting games are evolving, and these evolutions come from people who are extremely familiar with how the mechanics work. Or at least they are most of the time. In the same way we want new ways to express ourselves, so do the developers. With that, instead of blaming certain things on player expression, I think it's really okay for us to just say we don't like certain things over others. A game allowing you to express yourself has less to do with the amount of choices on paper that you can make, and rather the divergent options that you don't see at a glance. And remember, I'm not trying to make a sweeping statement, it's just that there's a reason we see this player expression argument pop up twice a year, and that reason is, I don't think anyone is actually on the same page when they say player expression. If I wasn't able to express myself in Street Fighter 6, I wouldn't be able to line this video with custom combos that nobody else has done and show them off. This game might be the pinnacle of player expression when it comes to building a character and making moves and combo routes and all of that stuff. So with that, that's all I've got for now. I'll see you in the next one.